So I think that both of these guys, first off, they owe Yuri Prochazka and Jan Blachowicz, not Yuri Prochazka, but yeah, Yuri Prochazka, Jan Blachowicz, and Magomed Ankalaev. They owe them Christmas presents for being for taking themselves out of the equation.
What's up, everybody? Laura Sanko here, and first breakdown of 2023. I had to bring him back. You know what? I might just make Dean a regular on this channel because he brings so much knowledge. He brings so much good stuff, and I appreciate him every time he graces our presence. Dean, how's your New Year's?
The New Year's was great. The holidays was great. I know you always make fun of me about my lighting issue. I didn't get a light for Christmas, but I know I got a light right here and I'm overexposed. This must be what I look like when I die and go to heaven. Just this big old light in my face. Yeah,
it's good. It's better than not enough light. You look great. You look great.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
Much. Well, I'm just glad that we got fights back. You know what I'm saying?
Woo. It does feel weird to have so many weeks. Obviously, we had some this past weekend, but you know that there was a stretch there where it was I felt lost on Saturday. I didn't know what to do with my hands.
It's true. Like everybody talks about, oh, we want to break, blah, 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 or the UFC this, too many fights. Man, when we have more than 2 weeks off, we go crazy.
We do.
We got to have fights. And I'm glad to have fights. And I'm glad to be back on here breaking them down with you.
Absolutely. And what a great card. What a great first pay-per-view card of the year. First off, we got to talk about the location. We are going to be in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. We haven't been back to Brazil in...
What do you mean this we stuff? What, are you speaking French now? Are you talking to Cyril Gahn? What do you mean free? You mean you?
It's the royal we. I embody the UFC. I just... Okay. And I'm going. So, you know, so we haven't been back to Brazil in a couple of years. Brazilian crowds are always crazy, but I am anticipating this crowd in particular, given the characters that are on the card, given the fact we haven't been there in a few years. I think it's going to be absolutely nuts. And it may be a bit of an X factor in some of these fights that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, well, when you think about it, like the two main events, the co-main event and the main event has Brazilian guys in it. So that obviously brings some extra drama and extra tension. And you're right. The Brazilian fans, they always get behind their people. And this should be no different. This should be exciting. It should be dramatic. And you're lucky to be going. Like in a certain way, you were very lucky to be going. Like for me, I'm not going. I'm glad. I will be working the desk though. But yes. I'm kind of glad I'm not going. But in a way, I'm jealous of you because you get to go. Well,
samesies. You get to be safe and cuddled up in Bristol doing your thing. But regardless, it's gonna be amazing. There's really there is no other crowd in the world that, you know, in unison chants, you're going to the opponents of their fighters. It really is such an intense crowd down there. And I expect it to be incredibly intense, especially for this main event, Glover Teixeira, Jamal Hill for the vacant light heavyweight title. Not the fight, to be honest with you, that I was imagining was going to be happening for this, but as I started to kind of look through it, I like it. I think it's an interesting fight, more interesting maybe than people are giving it credit for.
No, it's a great fight to make. I mean, it really is kind of a changing of the guard, but then it's also kind of a way that we give Glover his props and give him his due for all he's done for the sport. So I love the main event. Actually, I think that it's going to tell us a lot about both guys. But I will say this, you talked about the chant that the Brazilians do. And the one thing that we have to understand is that I don't think they necessarily mean it literally. Like we take it literally, but I think it's a slang to them that just kind of means maybe something even worse.
You're going down, whatever.
But yeah, maybe something worse than you're going to die. Yeah. But we take it nice and literally, but I don't think we should though. Because I don't think they really mean.
I take your point. They're not vengeful. Actually, it's one of the most friendly cultures that you'll ever come across. They're the warmest people ever. I'm just saying the intensity that they cheer.
Yeah, it's gonna be hot in there. It's gonna be crazy.
And especially when you got a guy like Glover, who, you know, his whole story, his whole journey to the championship belt, getting the belt when he was 42 at the time, now 43 years old, with the possibility of getting that belt back. I mean, what a huge opportunity. And for him to be able to possibly make that happen in Brazil, I mean, it's like the story has been written all except for the last chapter. But Jamal Hill, I mean, in looking at the interviews he's been doing leading up to this, the man's in a good mental spot. And I think he's in a spot where he feels like he could, you know, really change the ending of that story to make it not be quite such a fairy tale.
Well, one is you got to give both those guys props for being available, for doing their jobs and being available, because that's important. A lot of fighters, they complain, they gripe, they do that, and then they end up shooting themselves in the foot and not get the opportunity. The opportunity arose for them, and Dana was like, you know what? Let's make this fight happen. And they were there. Now,
Yeah.
had they been in a different situation, they might have gotten passed up. So I think that both of these guys, first off, they owe Yuri Prochazka and Jan Blachowicz, not Yuri Prochazka, but yeah, Yuri Prochazka, Jan Blachowicz, and Magomed Ankalaev. They owe them Christmas presents for being for taking themselves out of the equation. And then for those two guys, Glover Teixeira and Jamal Hill, for being available, for being ready, and being in the position to take this fight, just works wonders for both of them.
And taking it so quickly. I mean, my understanding is that Jamal Hill got the call during Ankalaev's post-fight interview with Joe Rogan. That's how quickly they started to put this fight together. And I think it was that night that it was finalized. So to your point, I mean, both of these guys ready and willing to do, you know, whatever it takes. And for Glover to get back to the belt, and for Jamal Hill, as he put it in a really great interview that he did with Ariel Helwani, you know, for him, he said it's not really necessarily about the outcome. It's about finding out if he's as good as he thinks he is. And the way that he said it is so much more articulate than how I just paraphrased, but it's a great interview. I encourage you guys to go watch it. But in terms of like style, it feels kind of black and white. You know, you've got the guy who's really good at grappling, Glover Teixeira, amazing jiu-jitsu, amazing boxing. I mean, veteran experience. And on the other hand, you've got a guy who's got fantastic boxing, not much of a ground game, and not that much experience in comparison to Glover. So it feels very like black and white. They're very different fighters. But I think when you dig into the skill sets, especially in the striking realm, things are maybe a little bit closer than they seem to be. I'm wondering your assessment though, because it feels, some people are saying, okay, one punch from Jamal, one takedown from Glover, we know how the fight's going to be. Do you agree with that or disagree?
I disagree with that, because I think we're taking Glover's striking ability lightly. And I think that we underestimate some people's other skill sets because they're so good in one area. So Glover's so good on the ground that that's what we think he's made of. But we can't forget that he is a power puncher as well. He had Yuri out a couple times, you know, with his left hook and overhand rights. When he's able to connect on you, because he's got really good fundamental punching skills. When he's able to connect, he can do damage. So he can do damage to Jamal Hill if Jamal Hill gets a little lazy. So it's not just about Glover getting that takedown. It's about him being able to put it together and being young on the 21st. Like, he has to fight a young fight at some level. It has to be mature. But Jamal Hill, I was analyzing him just recently, and he's so fast, he's so precise, he's so educated in the game for such a young man, that he makes up for his lack of experience and his immaturity. He makes up for it with those intangibles and this insane belief in himself. Like, that belief in himself really carries him far. So in terms of it coming down to a dogfight, it's very similar to the Yuri Prochazka and Glover fight. When it came down to a dogfight, it was easier for Glover to give up than it was for Yuri, because Glover's older. And I think once you get older, you start to analyze life in a different way, and it's easier to give up. Glover cannot allow this to turn into a dogfight, because we saw Jamal Hill's got that dog when he fought Thiago Santos. If this turns into a dogfight, Glover can't win that.
Jamal Hill's striking is such an interesting thing for me, because I have to be perfectly honest. I think coming off the Contender Series, I would have maybe not given him as much credit as was due in terms of like his technical ability. You know, obviously a lot of power knocking guys out, but I didn't always see, I guess, the thought behind some of the things that he was doing. He always looked a little wild to me, but over, I would say, the last like 3 or 4 fights in particular, it really feels like he's injected a ton of fight IQ, and maybe it was always there and I just wasn't seeing it, but it feels like he's really matured even in the area of the game that he was already best at, to the point where, you know, as a southpaw, he does such a good job. I mean, he keeps that power weapon loaded at all times, but with his right hand, He's doing a lot of great work to be able to set up the power, and his right hand has become a weapon in and of itself as well. I don't know, did you see him that way as well, or you're a lot smarter than I am? Maybe you always
No,
knew.
I mean,
You always knew.
he he was under the radar for a very long time with me up until he fought Jimmy Crute. Then when he fought Jimmy Crute, then I had because I had picked against him. I thought he was just, these guys come up to a dime a dozen. They're, decent strikers or here or there. Then they make mistakes. And we realize that they're not that great. Very similar to like Johnny Walker. When Johnny Walker came out, we're like, oh my God, he's the greatest ever. Then we realized that he's got holes. And that's what I thought about Jamal Hill. I said, okay, he's, got some knockout power, but he has holes. But he's shown the ability to fix those things and to come out. And like you said, he's got this instinct for fighting. A wise woman once told me, she called it hood boxing. Or maybe it was ghetto boxing. I can't remember who exactly said it.
Would never use that word.
I don't know who said it, but I'm saying it now. But there is some built up sort of equity in having that ability of being able to stay there, look at punches and hit your target, because he doesn't have this crazy power. Like if he were to hit a machine, I don't think he'd have crazy power, but his connection, when he connects, his lines are always on point. He's always hitting home runs at the right spot. And he has that ability, and he targets, you see his eyes look at the target first and hit the exact spot that he needs to hit, which is why he does so much damage. If you watch his fight against OSP, he was hitting the body with them straight lefts, and then OSP would make an adjustment, then he'd come over the top, and then he'd make adjustments, then he'd kick him. I mean, his striking is just very precise, but it's underrated because it may not look as clean as, say, a Anderson Silva or Israel Adesanya.
Yeah. And the knees too. I mean, the knees, that the way that he's able to grab a clinch, land some knees. I mean, everything he does could be a finish in unto itself, but it is also a setup for the next possible thing that could be a finish in unto itself, because the volume that he puts out there, especially for this weight class, is just insane. And when you look at him, I mean, he's not an overly muscled guy. But I think that actually works to his advantage to some degree, because he's not lugging around, all that muscle mass, and it gives him the ability to have this ridiculously high striking output, which reminds me that I should probably run through some stats. I always see, whenever you come on, I just get so excited to talk to you, Dean, that I start forgetting about the stats.
Well, what are the stats?
Well, let me give you a few that popped out to me, at least. And obviously we've talked about a little bit of this already. The experience difference has to be talked about. And I'm talking just UFC records here. I'm not going to talk about the record overall, just UFC records. You got Glover Teixeira, who's 16-6. He's got 6 knockouts, 7 submissions, 3 decisions. And then you got Jamal Hill, who's 5-1, 4 knockouts, and 1 decision. And of course, he had the one loss was the loss to Paul Craig, where he basically his arm snapped in half. Knockdown average per 15 minutes for Jamal Hill is 1.23, which to give you guys an idea, the UFC average is 0.29. The guy's knockdown average is absolutely insane. It speaks to what you were saying, Dean, not just the power, but the accuracy with which he throws his offense. Strikes landed per minute for Jamal Hill, 5.8, just 3.6 for Glover Teixeira. Jamal's is actually the second highest in light heavyweight history. So super, super high volume. On the flip side, you got Glover Teixeira, who averages 2.12 takedowns per 15 minutes. And Jamal's is a big fat 0. He's not looking to take
he's not shooting.
No, he's not shooting on anybody. And lastly, this one I found really interesting. So Glover, in his entire UFC career, has had 5 knockdowns. He's also been knocked down 5 times. And he has many, many more fights in the UFC than Jamal Hill does. Jamal Hill, in his short UFC run, already has 4 knockdowns and has never been knocked down 1 time in the octagon. So just some interesting numbers to think about in terms of where the strengths lie, but it's sort of, it's kind of what we were thinking. Do you feel like, excuse me, Jamal did a good job defensively wrestling against Thiago Santos, and I want to say, was it Clifton Abreu, who is another good grappler?
Yeah.
Do you feel like his defensive wrestling is good enough, though? Because Glover Teixeira is an animal in that regard.
Well, you have to understand, like, he has to be able to stop the initial penetration of Glover Teixeira, in which Glover probably does that maybe better than anybody in MMA. Like, if you watch the way he strikes to his wrestling, I mean, it's fluid. and he does it better than anybody else. So if Jamal Hill can stop the initial penetration, then he may be able to stop the shot. But if he can't stop the initial penetration, the way Glover chains his wrestling together, once he gets in there, once he's in deep, he should be able to get Jamal down. Now, that's the biggest X factor in this fight, is we've never seen Jamal Hill actually go up against somebody of that caliber wrestling. Thiago Santos is not a wrestler.
No.
He turned into a wrestler for that fight, and it showed because he got tired. He couldn't maintain his pace, and it showed. Gleison Abreu never shot. The only person who really tried to take Jamal Hill down was Darko Stocic, and he did, but he couldn't keep him down. He couldn't keep him down for more than 30 seconds. So we don't know how Jamal Hill is going to do against that caliber of wrestler. That's the biggest X factor of the fight. But and here's the thing, though. But with Glover, we kind of know how he's going to do against Jamal Hill. Like, he's fought guys.
Yeah.
He hasn't fought Jamal Hill, but I mean, like, think about it. Like, he put Brazil on his back. He got Alex Pereira, brought him up to live, in the same town as him, took him under his wing. Wellington Turman, same thing. So he's got these young guys in camp with him that he can kind of get the look that he needs. But we don't know how Jamal Hill's going to do it, and that's the X factor.
And we also, at least for me, that image of Glover Teixeira on top of Anthony Smith, Anthony Smith has an excellent ground game, a really good ground game. And the way that Glover was able to maintain top position and just punish Anthony to a ridiculous extent. I mean, it does make one believe that if he's able to get Jamal down and if he's able to get top position, it's going to be a really bad spot for Jamal. But to your point, that I think for a lot of people who grappling is not their predominant area of MMA, it's almost like the get up is as important as being able to wrestle offensively. The guys who can hit their butt and immediately pop up are the guys that do well, but the guys that end up settling, they get taken down and they settle for even half a second. That's when you get stuck there. That's when you get stuck there, and you don't want to get stuck there against Glover Teixeira.
Well, and that's the thing, is how well is Jamal going to be prepared for that? Did he have enough time to prepare for that and bridge the gap? Like, we don't know that. That's why this fight to me, is very difficult to pick. However, the problem is, it's difficult to pick now. But when it's over, it's going to look like that's the way it should have happened. Like, you're going to look back and go, well, of course he couldn't get up against Glover.
Yeah.
Or of course Glover couldn't take his punch.
Yeah.
But we just don't know these things yet. But after they fight that first time, we'll know what these guys are made of. This fight's going to answer a lot of questions.
Do you feel like Glover's fight with Yuri could potentially be an indication of how this fight might play out?
No, not really. And I'm going to be honest with you. I think Jamal Hill's better than Yuri. I think he is. I think he's a better fighter than Yuri. Yuri has a lot of things that he does, but I think Jamal Hill's defense is better. I think he may not be as well-rounded in terms of like on the ground and so on and have the experience like Yuri, but I think the danger factor of Jamal Hill makes up for that. His instincts makes up for what he lacks in all those other areas. I think he's a better fighter than Yuri. So it's hard to really measure the two and say, okay, because Glover was able to have some success against Yuri, because let's face it, he was beating Yuri until he gave up. He was having some success yet there. I think if Jamal Hill gets Glover in these bad spots, because he always ends up in bad spots, that's the end of the fight. That's the end. Like, Glover will end up in bad spots and comes back. But if Jamal Hill gets him in bad spots, he's not coming back.
Yeah. I find it fascinating, the whole situation with Anthony Smith, right? So originally Jamal and Anthony are supposed to be fighting, and then on air Anthony gets the news that Jamal has been plucked from his fight and put into this title picture, which had to be difficult to digest while you're on the ESPN desk.
He's like, what?
Yeah, I bet. Were you on that one? I can't remember.
I wasn't on that one. No.
Oh Lord, I can't imagine. But then we have this fascinating wrinkle of not only is Anthony the backup fighter for this card, but he and Jamal spent, the majority of Jamal's camp training together. What are your thoughts on that?
Anthony's going out there cutting weight, and he's the best. It's crazy, but it's not that crazy to a guy like me.
Yeah.
Because I come from a different generation where we would fight, like, you'd show up to a bar and be like, all right, who's fighting? And like, that's the generation that I come from. And That and for like, and I bet even for Glover, like Glover probably doesn't think it's that crazy because Glover's from the same generation.
Mhm.
It's the new school of people that are, all about business and all about the sport aspect of it, probably find it a little weird. I don't find it that weird at all. I mean, I know these guys know each other, but Anthony's an honest guy. He's gonna be like, hey, listen,
Yeah.
we're just gonna fight, and if you catch me, you catch me. If it's what it is.
100%. I feel like if you know I don't know Jamal as well, but I know Anthony pretty well. I feel like if you know Anthony, it's not all that surprising. But on paper, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe these guys are doing that. But Anthony's kind of, even though he's not been fighting as long as you have, he's kind of got that old school mentality. He's been fighting a long time. The guy's got like, I don't know, 60 plus fights, on his record. I remember watching him in, Barnes in Nebraska years and years ago. So he kind of has that OG mentality as well. And I don't think it was ever something that either of them thought was overly weird.
Well, in the Midwest, if you fight in a barn, that counts for 5 fights.
Does
So
it
like
really?
yeah, it counts for 5 fights.
Okay,
Being
then
in Nebraska, so he's probably got about 500 fights.
okay, then and I'm 10-1.
Yeah, you 10-1. It
11 and
counts. You know
1.
what I'm saying? It
Okay.
counts because like being in the Midwest, it just adds in an extra wrinkle and adds an extra layer
I like that.
these differences that gives you guys some advantages.
I like that a lot. I guess my last interesting thing to talk about is just the X factor of pressure, right? Because on one hand, you've got Jamal Hill, who has seemingly all the time in the world left in his career. He's potentially just reaching his peak, or maybe even isn't even at his peak yet. He's on his way up. We're not sure yet. Glover Teixeira has had the belt, lost the belt. He's 43. And it's a beautiful moment to think about him getting that belt back in Brazil. But I wonder your thoughts on, like, sometimes those moments become too big. The story of what could happen becomes so powerful that it creates a lot of pressure. And now half of me is like, well, he's such an OG. I don't know that he really thinks about things like pressure and stuff like that. But I don't know, as you start to think about the end of your career and what you want to be remembered for, does that change things? Who do you feel like has more pressure here? The guy who's walking into enemy territory, with an insane fan base, or the guy who's potentially looking at the end of his career and so desperately wants to go out? I'm not saying this is the last fight, but go out with that belt in Brazil.
I think Jamal has more pressure than Glover, but I don't think Jamal realizes it, and he won't realize it until he's in trouble. And this is one thing that me and DC always said when we think about Jamal or some of these younger fighters is that they're so naive and they don't necessarily recognize the pressure and what's at stake sometimes until later in life. Like right now, I think Jamal Hill is, he talks so great and he says all the right things, and then he's went out there and he's proved himself. Like he's done everything he said he would do. So there's no reason for him to not believe in himself. But it's the time when he falls short is when he's going to go, man, wow, this is a little bit big. So I think this is big right now. But if he goes out there and he finds himself in a lot of bad spots, then I think it's going to hit him. And I think then that pressure, the underlying pressure is going to expose itself because it's there, but he doesn't necessarily realize it right now. For Glover, it's not there because Glover recognizes that he's 42. Now, think about this. Glover quit in his last fight. There was no reason for Glover to stay on his knees and get choked out by Yuri Prochazka. That was a man who gave up. He quit. So we know that that exists in him. So there's no pressure for Glover. He's already been the champ. He's representing his country. He's done everything in the fight world. He's a Hall of Famer in his own right, whether he gets in or not. But in his own right, he's a Hall of Famer. He's got nothing left to prove. I think he can go out and be like, I did my best and I'm good. But for Jamal Hill is now he's talked the game, he's walked the game, and I don't think he believes that he can fail. So for him, he's not feeling the pressure until he sees himself in a spot where there's pressure. Then I think it's going to hit him.
Do you feel that pressure on the walk, or do you feel it when things start going wrong in the fight?
He's going to feel it when it starts going wrong in the fight. He's not going to feel it in the walk. In fact, in the walk, he's going to be great in the walk.
Yeah.
The boos are going to fuel him. And that's the one thing that I don't think the Brazilians realize is that the negativity actually fuels the fighter because now it takes some of the pressure off.
Yeah.
Because they know that they can't, what are you going to do? Make them mad? It's harder. It's harder when you're trying to please everybody because now you got all this weight on your back. But when everybody's booing you, you're like, oh man, this is great.
Yeah.
I can't let nobody down. They're already against me.
I won't keep you much longer on this one, Dean. What type of fight are you expecting? What do you think this fight's going to look like?
Oh wow, I tell you what, I think it's going to be one-way traffic either way.
Hmm.
I do believe that it's one way either way. If Glover, if Glover puts his hands on him and takes him down easy and it looks really easy, then it's going to be an easy fight for Glover. I don't necessarily expect that, but that's how it's going to be if he can. If Jamal puts Glover in trouble, like I said earlier, if he puts him in trouble, he's going to finish Glover because he's just too accurate and he feels himself, and that belief in himself has value in itself. So either way, this fight's going to be one-way traffic.
I like that. I think, and I agree with you. I think it's going to be, and we're going to know pretty early, I would imagine.
Yeah, and we're going to know early. It's not going to take us long. I mean, Glover might start a little slower, and Jamal might make a few reads for about 30 seconds, and then they're going to get into it.
Yeah.
Once somebody gets cracked, they're going to get into it.
I start swanging and banging.
Yeah.
Dean, I appreciate your assessment on this fight. I always love hearing your insights. This is going to be a good one, man. I'm super excited for this. I will be down in Brazil. You will be in Bristol, Connecticut, which is way cooler, if I'm being honest. So check Dean out on ESPN. Appreciate your time, Gene, and we'll see you guys next time.
Holla.